I'm Sahana Dharmapuri. I'm the director of Our Secure Future, Women Make the Difference. And it's a women, peace, and security program. We're based here in Washington, D.C. A feminist foreign policy, I think, is really based on the idea of equality and using that principle of equality in all kinds of security and peace decision-making. A feminist foreign policy brings a different perspective, a different set of critical analysis to understanding problems, which is called a gender perspective or gender analysis. So I think that's another really key component of how do we get to this idea of equality, practically speaking. And then I think the third thing is the increase in women's representation and participation in meaningful decision-making in foreign policy arenas. So I think that those criteria are really central to this idea of having a feminist approach to foreign policy. And then I think under that umbrella, we have the ways in which women and men who have a feminist lens on foreign policy actually do the work, which is a human rights-based approach to security. So I think what's really extraordinary about where this term feminist foreign policy really originates from is in the work of women from the global South, who really pushed this agenda called Women, Peace, and Security 20 years ago or more. It has its antecedents in the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. It is from the Declaration in Beijing. It has roots in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, human rights, for all people, equality, full participation, the dignity of life, etc. So where can we rely on this feminist lens to come through in our foreign policy really is coming out of the Women, Peace, and Security agenda, because it was in October 2000 that the Security Council passed UN 1325, which was an effort by women in what we call the global South, non-Western countries that were experiencing conflict. These women got together. They have no money, no territory, no real political power, and yet they were able to organize themselves and put this agenda in front of the highest decision-making body in the world on security matters, which is the UN Security Council, and tell leaders of the countries that the way we're doing our foreign policy and matters of peace and security is just not working, because you are not including the voices of civil society, and particularly you're not including the voices of women who are fighting for human rights and social justice in these countries. So I think, that is a really significant moment in history for all of us globally, not just for women and not just for certain countries, but for the world. It really changed the way nation states have to think about how they address foreign policy issues, because it required then, from then on, the idea that peace cannot be achieved without paying attention to the equality between men and women, boys and girls, etc. And so what that means practically is, so that gets to your question, where can we rely on a feminist foreign policy coming into play in our decision making? So we have that understanding that this agenda has been around for 20 years. We also know that there are many other subsequent resolutions under the umbrella of Women, Peace and Security and Resolution 1325. Now we have 80 plus or 85 plus countries around the world that have national action plans that have also been civil society driven, particularly by women-led civil society in those countries. Those are exercises, policy exercises in which security actors, political actors, and civil society, women-led civil society, get together and talk about security and peace priorities and come up with an action plan to actually address these things in practical ways throughout their, their policy machinery, their international development work, their domestic concerns, right? So, okay, how can we get even more granular about it? What does that mean for perhaps the individual person sitting in some capital that gets a proposal from or gets a mandate to say, you have to create a development assistance project on landmine clearing that we're negotiating in an upcoming peace agreement so that we can deliver the donor funds that we're getting. So how does that person actually create that project? They have to rely on the information that they're getting from outside sources, from the contractors they hire through their system to do assessments. And one of the things a feminist foreign policy requires, as per Women, Peace and Security, is the use of a gender analysis. And that gender analysis needs to be taken into account at the beginning of these strategic processes, right? So this is just obviously all hypothetical, but that person would include any publication or gender analysis and interviews with local women society, civil society groups in that country about what their priorities are, what their experiences are. How do landmines affect them? Where are they, for example? And all of that information would help to feed into the design of the resulting project and the way the money is spent and the way the donors' money is spent, and in this effort to clear landmines. The problem is, and what women have been saying, is in order to get to that point of being able to be part of the design of projects like that, and basically the design of the policies and laws that affect our lives, our daily lives, we have to be at the table at the very beginning to say, when you're talking about landmine clearing, gender affects that. The different roles that men and women and boys and girls and third sex have in our societies are differently impacted by the things that we're doing and differently impacted by this issue. And we've seen that in previous peace agreements and negotiating. For example, in Angola, a colleague of mine always tells the story that he was part of that negotiation and he felt very proud that it was the resulting document agreement was gender neutral. But what he didn't realize, and the people who negotiated didn't think of, is several months in, they realized being gender neutral was the same thing as being gender blind. And that because on landmine clearing specifically, there was a provision to clear landmines and there was money going to that effort from the donor community. And the areas that were being cleared for landmines were main roads, right? But the problem is the majority of the population after a post-conflict situation is usually women and children. You have all of those people returning back to their home villages and communities. And that was largely an agrarian, subsistence agrarian society. And women and children are doing most of the agricultural labor. Well, guess where the landmines were placed? in the fields. So when all of those people were returning to their homes and villages and starting to restart the productive base of the economy, their fields, they were dying. And that is a really clear consequence of gender blindness, of not including women's experiences and perspectives in high-level security decision-making. It has real impact on people's lives on the ground in a negative way, but also could be in a positive way if it was addressed differently in the beginning. Okay, so I'm not sure what you mean by extant statecraft, so I'm going to make some assumptions here, but I think the thing is that feminist foreign policy has come out of 20 years of policy architecture building by the women who've been pushing women, peace, and security. And that policy architecture at the international level, the domestic level, the local level, is what guides what we're calling, I think, statecraft, right? Like how do we, how do high contracting parties, the states, interact with each other? What are state-to-state relations like? But also, what are states' relationships with their own citizens? And how do states interpret or behave both with their citizens, but also on the global commons, right? That's what I'm gonna work with your question. So the thing is, women, peace, and security as a policy agenda has created this policy architecture of more than, I think we have about 9 resolutions under the women, peace, and security umbrella today that discuss and promote all kinds of issues that are related to peace and conflict, and then actually reinforce these critical components that I've been talking about of increasing women's representation in meaningful ways in decision-making, in security decision-making, and also using gender perspectives in all kinds of issues, a range of issues actually, from post-conflict reconstruction to trafficking, to sexual and gender-based violence and conflict, to prevention of violent extremism, etc., right? To monitoring and evaluation, peacekeeping missions, what have you. So that policy architecture is there. And it's not something that came from some small civil society organization. This is policy architecture that has come up from the ground. A lot of it has been influenced by civil society, women-led civil society, feminist perspective, and has been adopted at the global level by member states. So we have the policy architecture that is now, over these past 20 years, getting adopted into, say, Chapter 7 resolutions when there's a new peacekeeping mission that goes out into, it's getting adapted and embedded into the architecture and the agendas within the systems. So for example, now there are military gender advisors throughout the Department of Peacekeeping Operations in different peacekeeping missions. There's a requirement for that, and there's a requirement for military gender advisors at the very strategic level, top level of a mission, the operational level, and the tactical level. And that's not just at the United Nations. Now it is spread to other countries. Ireland has the system. Sweden has the system. You know, the Scandinavian countries have it, but so does South Africa. So do other countries in the world. They're slowly adopting these practices domestically, right? And on top of that, on top of this global policy architecture, we have more than 80 countries in the world that have adopted, as I said before, national action plans. And those national action plans are not just important in terms of the document that exists, but it's also the process by which they were developed. The process is a multi-stakeholder process that includes civil society in security decision-making, and in security governance, which is, that has never really happened before. And I don't see it happening in the way that women have been able to make it happen and feminists have been able to make it happen in this arena. I do not see that kind of change in security governance happening in, say, for example, the nuclear field, right? Or pick another, you know, whatever we want to call hard security field. Those changes are not just sort of the hot, new, interesting topic of today. These changes we're seeing now and are becoming more visible now is resting on that 20 years of work by women from the global South and the global North, women and men who have a feminist lens, a gender, and know how to use a gender perspective, working together over this time period to create this architecture that is very, I have to say, very strategic and very clever. It's really goes back to our feminist roots of, let's take a long-term strategic approach to problem solving. Let's take a human rights-based approach to problem solving, which means including a diverse set of voices, which means using consultation and dialogue, which means using, you know, really resting on human rights frameworks to inform our decision making. So I don't think people really see or hear the nuances of that and how much these ideas and practices are actually already embedded in the system when we use the words feminist foreign policy recently, mostly because it seems like that's a new idea coming out of the West, when in fact, it's something that women all over the world, and I have to say men as well, have been working on for the last 20-something years. Well, I think if we follow the tenets that we set down originally, which is to include women-led civil society from the ground and have those civil society voices in, you know, fully participating in these types of international peace and security arena, international relations problems, that's how you decolonize it. Is that's the answer. You've got to have local participation. You've got to have ordinary people's voices presenting that social justice perspective. And it isn't just about women. I think that that's where we kind of go wrong, is we have to say, this is not something only women can do or only women should do or only women can do, right? This is about changing all of our perspective on how to create a more peaceful world. And it really is a shift in the way we think about peace and security and how to create a more peaceful world. Some people think that to create a more peaceful world, you have to have more weapons for protection, for protecting your territory and your resources and your people, right? But I think what the feminists from the, you know, outside of power are saying, or let's say established power structures are saying, is that's not true security. We cannot be secure at the expense of other people. That's actually not going to achieve the goal of a more peaceful society. And that's what the aim of international relations is, right? Like for states to be able to resolve their problems without violence, right? And sometimes it's out of mutual interest and sometimes it's not, right? But to avoid violence and unnecessary suffering of people. That's what governments are there for, to serve people. So if we really want to decolonize foreign policy in general, then we do need to have a multiplicity of voices. And we need to have the diversity of experience and values and priorities. And that comes from civil society organizations working in their countries who can tell us what are the opportunities and what are the challenges that they're facing, and where are the reasonable entry points in which we can make an actual difference in people's lives. So I think I'm just going to speak sort of broadly, but also specifically for feminist foreign policy priorities. I think concretely, one would be, let's get all member states to adopt national action plans on women, peace, and security, and let's get those things funded. Because it's true, we have a much greater number of countries that have national action plans now on women, peace, and security, but very few, a small percentage of those are actually funded and have budgets. And you can't really have a policy priority that has no budget, then it's not a priority, you know. So that's a concrete action that all member states can take, whether they have a national action plan or not. Another way of doing it is also in the United States, we've adopted a law on women, peace, and security. Again, it doesn't have funding, but it is quite significant in the direction it gives to the US State Department, the Department of Defense, the Department of the Agency for International Development, and the Department of Homeland Security in the United States. And the things in it gives them very specific direction about creating strategies and what they have to do to show that they're implementing women, peace, and security with these tenets of using a gender perspective, increasing women's representation and decision-making. In terms of the hard security sector, which I think you might be referring to, for example, militaries, I think is what you might be referring to. Look, we're already transforming those military structures. I think that's another oversight on our part when we are not looking at the big changes that have been made, the significant changes that have been made in militaries around the world, in peacekeeping structures around the world. Those things happened because of women from the global South, feminists pushing this agenda. Those countries did not come up with the idea for a military gender advisor if we're in a peacekeeping mission by themselves. That came from women. They and these women, these feminists who are pushing this more feminist perspective. So, and what I've seen personally is that applying this idea of equality, this principle of equality, and applying a human rights-based approach to security decision-making is already transforming the way the security sector thinks about security. And what I mean by that is it is taking not only the state's interests into account in security decision-making, such as protecting territory and natural resources, but this feminist lens of a gender perspective is also mandating that security actors think about the impact on ordinary people, individual people. And this is a struggle that we've seen happen at the state level with the issue of responsibility to protect, right? Where state sovereignty was states were feeling threatened. Their state sovereignty was feeling threatened. And we got into a whole discussion of state responsibility, state rights, etc. But women, peace, and security, the UN 1325, which was passed in 2000, before the summit in 2005 on responsibility to protect ever even happened, already states that it respects state sovereignty, member states respect state sovereignty, and they take into account the security of the individual in their decision making, which is, I think that is of such significance that, and yet we don't realize that that's really the seed and the origination of this kind of conversation we're having today of how can we transform security. That's where it started, with that feminist movement and approach to security. So when we talk about transforming these structures and systems, I think we're sort of forgetting that the whole approach that we started 20 years ago is a strategic long-term approach of transformation from the inside. And it is a nonviolent approach. It is not tear it down and replace it with something else. It is really trying to reach almost every individual person in those structures to get them to think in a way that respects human rights and the dignity of people's lives. I think that the irony of this is that we are in the revolution. Women, peace, and security is a political project. It is a political feminist project, and it's about human rights promotion. And so I don't think there's going to be a time that I don't think it's realistic to say we're going to dismantle everything and rebuild it again from scratch. That's not actually very strategic or efficient. I think this feminist approach of let's start talking to each other, let's look at our policies, let's review our legislation, let's look more closely at how are we doing the work. Let's look at our processes and see where we're failing and then do course correction, right? We are living this revolution. I completely believe that we are living the revolution. We are enacting it in our daily work, and that in a way it's a mistake to think that there's going to be some magic wand that we wave and everything is suddenly dismantled and then reformed again. No, we as human beings are the ones that have to create and design our world. And what women are saying and feminists are saying, and I would include, some men in that too, who also identify as feminists and are champions of gender equality, is that everybody needs to be involved in the design of our world. It's not about dismantling things, it's about creating something better. And we are transforming it. I feel what I've seen even over the last few years in my work, this world has, in our relationships, and it's not just because of the pandemic, this has happened before the pandemic, where people's attitudes and their willingness to have conversations about a feminist foreign policy, even use that language, to talk about the inclusion of women and just marginalized groups, chronically marginalized groups on a more regular basis. I think these are all really great signs. It's a lot easier for us to point out where things are failing, But I think if we spent more time pointing out where things are working, we would put more energy there too. And I think the real issue is not dismantling the structures that we don't like. It's actually paying attention to the shrinking civil society space, because that's really what we need. We need a robust civil society that is focused on these ideas of human rights and equality and dignity, and having strategic approaches to changing things, because that's our long-term view of designing this world and creating it and living in it, right? So I think if we could spend more time thinking, how do we strengthen our relationships, strengthen civil society, and make it a more creative endeavor versus a destructive endeavor, I think that will serve all of us. But the fact is, it's happening anyway, right? The fact that you are doing this project, the fact that I work in Washington, you're in India, like there are people all over the world who want to create a better world, and they're doing it in their ways. So I feel like we should never be discouraged. We should always see that human beings are inherently good, and we all want to live in a better world. And we just need to connect more on that.